Boom. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and we're about to have some fun digging into Bonhoeffer, wrestling with some big questions. And Jeff and I are pretty pumped that today we are joined by Dr. Reggie Williams. So, buckle your theological safety belt and get ready for some fun. Now, before we dig in, and I want to spend a little bit of time for people to get to know Reggie, but Jeff, you and Reggie have had an ongoing relationship. For many of you will know he's been on the podcast before, where we learned that he had church history with Diana Butler Bass in undergrad. He had Glenn Stassen for his theology ethics, is doing theology and ethics at Fuller, who is part of the very, very small tribe of Baptists, the Holy Remnant of edgy Baptists that my family comes out of. So there are lots of connections, but maybe Jeff, you can introduce us to Reggie by sharing a bit about how y'all connected and y'all's ongoing conversation around Bonhoeffer.
Well, I knew of Reggie by reputation before we had actually talked in person, and his Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, which sort of looked at Bonhoeffer's relationship to the Harlem Renaissance and the shifts that created in Bonhoeffer's theology, is an absolutely crucial work for anybody that wants to understand Bonhoeffer. And the deep dive that he goes into the Renaissance writers, the Renaissance artists, the kinds of things that they were mediating to Bonhoeffer, not just in his work with Frank Fisher at Abyssinian Baptist with the youth group, but the kind of intellectual world that Bonhoeffer was being exposed to. It absolutely is crucial for understanding. Now, my personal connection with Reggie is that he's one of the most pastoral people that I know. And a couple of years ago, I had some difficulty with blood clots and resulting pulmonary embolism. And Reggie reached out to me after he found this out to let me know that I should really take this seriously and not just, poo-poo it away, because it was a serious matter. And I have forever appreciated that pastoral concern and that pastoral care. So not only is Reggie a cutting edge theologian, but he's also just a fine human being. And so over the years, then I've sort of followed Reggie. And when you asked me, Tripp, about this class, and we were thinking about resource people, he was one of the first people, as you well know, that came to mind, because he explores a trajectory of Bonhoeffer that is needed in Bonhoeffer studies and also just needed in Christian theology. So I'm going to leave it at that. Let Reggie talk for himself for a minute.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much. And I'm thrilled to see you doing really well. And this is, of course, what matters most, that we have our health and that we have each other. To speak for myself for a little bit, Tripp, what would you like me to say?
Well, maybe you could tell the origin story of you as a theologian. Like, what were the questions of your faith that sent you to become a nerd who then decided, the dead nerd I'm going to wrestle with is Dietrich Bonhoeffer?
That's a good question. That's a good question. And by the way, so I've got this cool, really new camera, and it does this automatic like cameraman thing, and it's like blowing my head up really large on the screen here, and it's freaking me out. I'm gonna have to change this a little bit here to another camera, so that it's not doing that with my head. Is that looking better? How's that? I think that's better.
I think you look good.
You looked good before.
Okay. All right. That was a little uncomfortable, Tripp. But let's keep going here. I got interested in Dietrich Bonhoeffer really during my doctoral studies with Glenn Stassen. I had an encounter with him in undergrad in a history course. At some point, I don't even remember which professor it was. It may have been Diana Butler Bass course that I took, because I took a lot of classes with her. Because my major was in church history, theology and church history, and she was the church history professor of for that bachelor's degree. And I did a little bit of interaction with him years later in a master's program. But it was really when I got into a PhD program that Stassen asked me to take seriously Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he had me TA a course for him in which he was teaching about Bonhoeffer. And as this goes, and I actually do something similar now to PhD students who work with me. I just lecture. All right, he just lectured. It was 60 students in the class, and I had all of the grade. So it was a deep dive into Bonhoeffer. And in that course that he was TAing, Glenn was insistent that Bonhoeffer had this really transformative time in New York. He was getting this from Ruth Zerner, an earlier Bonhoeffer scholar who wrote this really popular essay. This is popular with Bonhoeffer scholars, that gives us some history about Bonhoeffer in New York. And then he found another Bonhoeffer scholar, German Bonhoeffer scholar. Ruth Zerner was American, a U.S. citizen. Another Bonhoeffer scholar, Hans Pfeiffer, did an essay saying the same kind of thing, just differently. He did his in the 90s. Both of them were influential for Glenn, although Glenn was aware of this early on too, that New York played a role. For Glenn, it was Abyssinian Baptist, because Glenn was like a really hardcore Baptist theologian and ethicist. It was at Bonhoeffer's time at this Baptist church that did it. I had done some work on the Harlem Renaissance in my master's degree, specifically an artist from the Harlem Renaissance, Aaron Douglas, and I recognized that the time in New York corresponded with the Harlem Renaissance and the time that Aaron Douglas was doing his work. Glenn didn't have that on his radar. And in fact, no one who did work on Bonhoeffer in New York, none of these scholars did. Josiah Young did, but none of these scholars did. And I did a little bit of scratching to see what might be there to talk about with Bonhoeffer. And, it was a whole book. So in that engagement, I found it important to pay attention to biography, which is what I've done. His story, to tell a deeper story. And that is the way we interpret Jesus is formative for our Christian ethics, for our morality, actually, as Christians. Our interpretation of Jesus is deeply informative for our morality as Christians. And that's what the story is about.
Yeah. So when maybe you could say a bit about your own journey to becoming a theologian. And there were one of the questions that came in from another a Black church leader said, how did you come to take Bonhoeffer so seriously, and his connection to the Black church? Like, when you think of the faith that you're inheriting, and then this connection point in grad school, what were the kinds of questions Bonhoeffer wrestled with that then found a connection point in your own life of faith?
That's a good question. I was raised going to church family stopped going to church, and I had a connection. Something mattered for me when I was a kid. When I came back to faith by myself when I was in high school, 17. And I was interested in seeing how our interpretation of our faith makes a difference in daily living. I was early on thinking about that. Actually, as I think about it, it had to do with a connection that I made between my faith and the struggles that I was having against racism as early as 9, living in San Ramon, California, and going to Walt Disney Elementary School as the only Black kid in the school. Some kids would come to school and tell me what their parents said about Black people. And in the 4th grade, a teacher introduced me to Martin Luther King Jr. And he became hugely important to me for the rest of my life. Since then, he became hugely important to me since then. That that I can trace a clear connection to my faith and my work as an ethicist. And that moment in the 4th grade when I met, I was introduced to Martin Luther King Jr. So, and you'll see in my work with Bonhoeffer that in that book, it's as much about the Black church as it is about Bonhoeffer. And, King as a representative figure of that movement for Black life in the United States is doing so from a Black social gospel, a Black Baptist social gospel tradition. He's one of its most notable members, but he's doing it from within that tradition. It's not his own personality alone that drives this. It's the claim that God loves all God's children. So Bonhoeffer he enters into that tradition when he goes into New York. The same tradition that Martin Luther King Jr. is speaking from. That's one. The other thing is, as a Black theology student, a Black student doing theology, we all have to, those of us who go through seminary and divinity training have to be schooled in this particular world. Your European theologians and the Reformation and all this kind of stuff. But those of us who want to make sense of it for the world in which we live, you can't just study Origen and Tertullian and Augustine and so forth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You also have to pay attention to what's happening in your own world. The formative community where you come from. And really, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus is that kind of thing. I did that with papers going through my whole seminary training. I do a paper on Jürgen Moltmann and do some engagement with some aspect of Black life, to make sense of it. In other words, the required book list and the recommended book list, turn them into a paper.
Yeah. So when you got to this insight of not just like the Baptist experience of Bonhoeffer in Harlem, but the Harlem Renaissance and all that's taking place in there, you spend time dealing with this eruption of art and creativity that's there and such. Where was the kind of initial connection point where connecting these dots kind of shone a light from a different angle that people that have been spending tons of time with Bonhoeffer as scholars go, oh, like, I didn't anticipate these kind of connections or this energy flowing through his writing.
Where was the connector point that made that more legible, you're saying?
Yeah, where other Bonhoeffer scholars, when they get done reading your book, and this has already been said by people that have been in here in previous weeks, it was like after we read Reggie's book, we're like, oh, we didn't anticipate this, and now it's changed. So I'm thinking of your time like with your peers. because you kind of expanded his time, not to adding like the insights around the Harlem Renaissance, not just kind of the Black Baptist religious experience. Are there particular features that now the larger kind of Bonhoeffer community it kind of nod their head at, like, obviously, but before, no one had asked the question and pulled in the right threads?
I see. Well, some of the insights that I might be adding. I remember having a conversation with someone about a sermon that I feature at the end of chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the church chapter. It is specifically the Abyssinian Baptist Church chapter, and it comes after chapter 3, which of course is the Harlem Renaissance chapter. In chapter 3, I highlight the fact that young Black people in the Harlem Renaissance were saying that had we been there, we wouldn't have allowed this to happen to us, or we're not meek like our fathers, and this whole pie in the sky kind of faith is turning them away from the faith of their fathers. Okay, hoping for life after death is not something that they want. They want some peace and justice, some justice here in the world. So the claims of Christianity are making these people docile. This is what Harlem Renaissance scholars, young people in Harlem Renaissance are saying. That same claim shows up in preaching Bonhoeffer does in Germany when he returns. Doesn't it seem like these faith claims are just saying that these people should be quiet and put up with X, Y, and Z? Couple that with a catechism that he writes the summer he returns from New York, in which he is made a total reversal on claims that he's made about fighting for my sister, my brother, my mother, my sister, and so forth, my people, that for murder can sanctify war. He says that the Christian only prays for peace, and that for the sake of love of my neighbor, even though politics might make me uncomfortable, I must act politically to stand up for my neighbor. Instead of allowing faith to keep me silent, faith must cause me to act for my neighbor. It's these kinds of things, in addition to what scholars had already known about him writing to a young woman later on and saying, I hadn't yet become a Christian until I encountered the gospel, until I tell the Sermon on the Mount. Those are some of the standard things. The other thing that was important was that he writes to Bedka from prison in 44 and says that I hadn't yet changed, except for my first trip abroad, when I changed from the phraseological, the abstract, to the real or concrete. The smoking gun there for Hans Pfeiffer was the change in his attitude after New York. Well, I add to that some content, clear smoking gun content, about the preaching when he comes back, about the change in tone, about violence, and about ethnic pride, which is a focus on this clear emerging racial thing. These are some of the things that allow one to put the puzzle pieces together. In addition to him playing the spirituals for his students and telling young people that he's teaching a catechism in the east part of Berlin, stories of the Harlem Renaissance. And he's talking to Erwin Sutz in letters about this, telling them stories about the Harlem Renaissance to children. These things that clearly indicate that it's living with him. So
there's a certain, let me just, if you don't mind my jumping in, as I was reading Reggie's book, one of the things that struck me so much is that Bonhoeffer wasn't just exposed to a Black Jesus. He was also exposed to Black theory and identity. And there are critical tools, I think, Reggie can speak to this better than I can, that allow him to see his own ethnocentrism in New York in his time at Union, and give him that different lens. Like Reggie said, when he comes back, he looks at Germany differently. Reggie makes this point in his book, right? That, before in Barcelona, he has these sermons of German nationalism and Volk and Volkish theology. And when he comes back, he's got a far more critical eye as to how theology operates to construct that national cultural identities. And I think Reggie makes a good job of that. That comes from that year at Union, comes from his exposure to Black thinkers.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I think that's right. Yeah. Insofar as he was centered on Germany, as his primary loyalty, New York opens him up into a more ecumenical thing, a body of Christ broadly thing, not just strictly folkish. Very, folk is a really challenging word to try and to translate. We say people in translation of it, but it means something much more even spiritual than people. It's a line that was centered on the folk in the wake of the devastation of World War I. This is what's important to recognize, is that this guy was trained as a theologian after his brother was killed in the war. And when Germany, he had cousins that were killed. Germany was shamed. This is a moment where he's training to be a theologian. And he was really, really German-centric. But New York loosens him up to that. I would say he struggles for the rest of his life with some of that, with the role of theology and Christianity in helping to revive Germany. There is a kind of Germany that he wants to save, and there's a revival of Germany that he's hoping for. That he wrestles with, really kind of as a self against himself for the rest of his life. But yeah, I completely agree, Jeff. Being away does that for us, though. When you go in another country, you oftentimes have an opportunity to see yourself in your country in a different way, and then you go into, for this upper middle class white guy goes into a primarily Black community, worshiping in a Black church. It's not just being in the United States.
Yeah. Just personal anecdote. I remember one of my most profound encounters was in La Paz, Bolivia. And I had taken a group of students there to, we were helping to build a schoolroom out in the Amazon rain basin out in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, we're back at the Methodist Center in La Paz, and somebody had to go to the bathroom. And the guy unlocked a cabinet and pulled out the toilet roll and said, "Be careful with this. This represents the Bolivians' average daily wage."
Wow.
And I'd just been in a cab where 500,000 peso notes were littering the floor of the cab, and had been told that I was a communist because I was a Methodist. And that was one of those moments when I'm like, oh, the world doesn't work the way I understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's it was encounters like that, okay, this is what Bonhoeffer means by the voice of the underside,
Yeah.
and just, a whole different reality. Bonhoeffer experiences, I think his experiential encounter with that reality in America really did shift that change.
Yeah. There's I have no doubt. Of course, it's my argument.
You agree with yourself. That's always good.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Well, see, what I really enjoyed about the book is that you make very clear how a Eurocentric humanity, i.e. white supremacy, becomes the God-endorsed norm on a theological basis, and that was a theology constructed for an identity that resists incarnation, empathy, and transformation is the way I think you put it.
Right.
And that as long as you are constructing theology out of that basis, you're going to miss, for lack of a better word, Jesus.
Right.
So,
yeah. So thinking of it in this way is also helpful, just to translate what you said, which I find myself often doing in speaking in larger spaces, and I'm not just speaking to grad students, that Christianity associated with imperial Germany, imperial Britain, imperial Spain. It's associated with a set of empires. And as they practice imperialism with daughter colonies in Africa, and collecting people for sale in the slave trade, they are introducing these people to culture, civilization, and religion. There is nothing to learn from going into those different cultures as a Spaniard, as a Brit. There's nothing to learn. Those people must learn from the empire. It is naturally resistant to incarnation and empathy. It sees itself responsibly resistant to that. That is not what Jesus does. That is not what the apostles do. Another way of understanding the faith, then, is to be able to enter into different cultures. Now, there are people, if you read Willie Jennings, the Christian Imagination, who distort and dismantle the practice of empathy as in incarnation as well. They'll go into that culture and they'll learn the language, if only to force the people in a better way into the British.
Right.
But what if you're actually engaging in that community to hear where Jesus is?
Mm-hmm.
Or to hear that community on its own terms. Paul's "I become all things to all people so that I may be by all means save some." This incarnational move. That's the struggle. It's a different kind of what Jennings says, intimacy, a different kind of connectivity, of Christ-centered connectivity.
When you were laying that out in the lecture, it reminded me of Spavek's explanation of worlding and kind of post-colonial theory. And one of the stories used to explain it is the British colonialist in India, who then what's the goal is to map the territory. And so you get the wisest people of the land in the indigenous spaces, and you travel around with them creating a map, and now you're naming it, and now you're drawing the borders. And then when you get done, you've taken from the people the wisdom necessary to control its resources and its people, and then to harness their labor and resources for the colonial project, right? And now you have a map, and now we're sitting around in Europe dividing it up. And I think that like you did such a good job, even some of those images, right, of tying the colonial project. It would not make sense without religion as this abstraction that we can then use to justify the hierarchies of kind of Anglocentrism.
Right.
And there's like that picture and critique coming out of different kind of liberationist movements and post-colonial theory. And I would have never thought about those connections between Bonhoeffer's critique of religion and like Jeff and I's text thread about what we were watching. He's like, "Oh, wow, this is good." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah." And then just listening to and reading through the comments people brought up, there are quite a few who, are very familiar with Bonhoeffer and have wrestled with those kind of concepts of the a priori of religious and religionless Christianity and things, but never seen how powerful that is when the concept of religion gets even more problematized.
Yeah. It's good. That's it. Worlding is a really good way of describing that. Well, I mean, in common conversation, people don't recognize that there's a distinction between what you might call earth, the territory, the actual territory under our feet, and world, which is a boundaried, ownable space that we describe and lay in place on top of it. Geography is not without its ideological formation. That's what we're talking about. So when you talk about worlding here, a world that we've created, this description of the place that we own. I mean, the maps of the city, for example, where with the territories that you want to live in and what that territory encompasses, is the formation of a world, how we understand being in the world. What is the meaning of human? What is the meaning of community? All of this is derived from a definition of a world, which is really an ideological construct, a description of the geography. Does it? Yeah.
And then comes religion. Okay.
Yes.
And religion functions. Religion functions then to put a transcendent authority onto the constructions of our own hands,
mm-hmm.
and raise our constructions to the level of transcendent authority to where it should not be questioned, or it should just be obeyed, or you should just listen to those people who have access to that thing.
Mm-hmm.
God as object, going back to Reggie's lecture. So that religion in this way functions as that, Peter Berger writes this, and other social scientists, as the sacred canopy
mm-hmm.
over all of these creations at our hands.
Right.
So all systems of oppression, or all systems of even of goodness, all created by us. But religion comes and offers the kind of authoritative justification for those systems to remain in place without questioning or dismantling.
Right. So one of the challenges people have when you talk about religion is they immediately associate it with sacred, with God. And while there is some truth to that, that's not what it is in total. That's not what we're actually getting at. We're talking about one of the mechanisms for organizing the world. It is what you might say a part of the epistemic banking system that gives us knowledge of cultures and civilizations, an aspect of the development of anthropology by which we come to know people in places by mapping, as it were, going back to what Tripp was saying, sacred systems globally. The sacred system is an aspect of a culture to let you know their primitive status, their savage status, in relationship to Christian Europe, the people who are doing the mapping. And Christianity then, as religion, is a cultural aspect of the West that gives them superior status. In this non-empathic, non-incarnational information gathering process only, religion becomes one of these mechanisms of hierarchy. Another way of describing religion, I quoted my friend J. Cameron Carter in his book, The Anarchy of Black Religion, which is very, very good, very good. That religion is a way of giving value to matter. Primarily, it's a process of giving value. How do you evaluate and give value to matter, which has clear implications on social relationship and judging people. There's the story of an engagement between the British and the Akan. I believe it's the Akan people, where the British believe that if you take possession of the Ashantis golden stool. They have this golden stool, which is an aspect of governance for them. They believe this golden stool comes from God, and that each chief gets their own golden stool. They get the stool is how they pick the chiefs. The British believe that if we possess it, then they'll have to worship us, because they believe that their devotion is primarily in the stool. They're trying to understand the way their religion works, the value that these people place on that piece of material thing. That's the religious thing here. Of course, it doesn't work like that. They didn't understand all that was going on here with their valuation of the material. This religious structure of valuation for Europe is immaterial, non-bodied, rational, and spiritual. So where is the embodied encounter? Where is the concern for love your neighbor as yourself that has a fleshly weight, some fleshly weight to it? What would it mean to actually take embodied encounter as a serious way of loving your neighbor? The structures of religion that come out of imperial Europe are simply information gathering processes for hierarchy, and they have an added effect of significantly distorting our social relations.
That's important.
So I want to just sort of circle back to Bonhoeffer for just a minute. So for me, at least, what happens with Bonhoeffer is his embodied experience transforms with his experience in Harlem. And one of the sort of running themes through his theology and the things we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, Reggie, is the notion of concrete reality.
Yeah.
And Bonhoeffer's desire not to have Christianity or not to have faith spin off into abstraction, but to sort of stay anchored and grounded in the concrete reality, Christ existing as community.
Right.
And his understanding of that concrete reality, I think what you show performs a profound shift to a different understanding of the world than the one he had before he got to Union.
Exactly.
And because of his exposure to what was happening to him in Abyssinian, and with the other Black thinkers, and with his friendship with Frank Fisher.
Yeah, so true. So true. I think he's looking for something more concrete when he comes to New York. I think what he finds in Germany, this is telling this history, this biographical sketch is really helpful too, that his family believes that the church is simply what he was calling bourgeois, people. It's a part of Protestant culture. It's part of the Bildungsbürgertum's world, the upper middle class German world. People get married there, they baptize their children, they have catechism and so forth, but it's compartmentalized. And in the aftermath of World War I, people are jumping to their death, in depression there. People are wearing clothes made of paper and cloth. They're eating bread made of sawdust and flour. It's a really bad time. Does the church have anything to say about this? And to use this language, he's looking for something that can put your entire body under the gospel, under the claims. And there is no witness for that in Germany. He finds in New York a system a faith witness where one's whole body is under the claims of the gospel. Now, to his credit, it doesn't matter so much. Actually, it's not an impediment that these are Black people. He's listening to the language of Christ and to the gospel. Whereas, white people the white racist is simply going to see Black people talking. But there's a faith claim here that is total, not compartmentalizing. How could it not be? Because in a white racist country, this body is a target, but this body also identifies with Christ for Black people. That was hugely transformative for him. But it spoke to it also helped that his project prior to New York was trying to think about a Christian concept of persons that moved our understanding of human being and a person out of just the self-enclosed rational mind. You're not just a thinker, you're a body too.
Given the centrality of suffering, do you think that this changed his understanding of what suffering was?
That's a good question. A really, really good question. Some of the problem and I'm going to start with problem here, with Bonhoeffer in suffering, is that he is a wealthy, educated, arrogant, and I need to emphasize that he was young when he went to the United States. He was 24, and we often miss that. For him, suffering was a choice, always a choice. He was also a card-carrying Aryan. He did not have to suffer. But for some, suffering was not a choice. For too many people, suffering is not a choice. What did he understand about suffering? This is a good question. This is one worth engaging. What did he understand about suffering? His claims about the suffering God, about in a discipleship about choosing suffering, about relinquishing rights and so forth. These are all moves that the Christian must do, he says. But this is not what many liberation scholars are saying. A lot of liberation scholars are saying we must resist suffering. We must remove suffering, relieve suffering whenever we see it. So some folks see Bonhoeffer as really wrestling with himself here and his ego to some degree in this. And, I just heard this brilliant paper by a PhD student named Chris, what is Chris's last name? Out of Aberdeen. I want to say White, out of Aberdeen, who was actually problematizing Bonhoeffer's work on what Bonhoeffer's statement about the view from below, as if there was one view from below, and that to move from privilege to view from below is what we must do. Yes, there is that need to recognize who is suffering in the community that you call good. That's how I interpret Bonhoeffer's language there. That's important. You don't see the value of your community from the perspective of people who are doing great in this community that you call good, the Aryan, the straight white male in your community where, people who are not straight white male are targeted. You got to see the value of your community from the people who are harmed in the community that you call good. That's how you know if you're following Christ. That's what I hear him saying.
So there's a passage that showed up in the questions quite a bit that kind of brings this concept that you started with around problematizing the concept of religion and what it does and suffering. So I thought, since y'all are here and Jeff also wrote a book on this, I'll just read it and see what y'all two say to each other, because this sounds fun. It's like the perk of being the third wheel when Bonhoeffer nerds together. Because there were a bunch of questions, and it was around this. It's for those with the reader's edition, it's 481, but it's the very end of the second letter that Reggie picked. He says, human religiosity directs people in need to the power of God in the world. God is Deus ex machina. The Bible directs people toward the powerlessness and the suffering of God. Only the suffering God can help. To this extent, one may say that the previously described development towards the world's coming of age, which which has cleared the way by eliminating a false notion of God, frees us to see God, the God of the Bible, who gains ground and power in the world by being powerless. This will probably be the starting point for our worldly interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah. He has his finger on something hugely important in that in his what he's discovering in prison. It's important to recognize that he comes to these conclusions while he's powerless, while he actually doesn't have a choice in the suffering. He's a prisoner and he's alone. And the Nazis describe God, Nazi religion is not actually, it's not Christian religion. They are acting Christian early on until they don't need the church anymore. But the Nazi Christian described God as almighty. And the connection between as they understand the God of history and the God of blood and soil is power. The same is done today by Christians who wrap their Bible in a flag. And many Christians, not just wrapping their Bible in a flag, but they these colors don't run stuff, and you might say that the crucifixion is a momentary embarrassment in the life of Christ, who is risen with all power. This is primarily the faith here. Their Christ wasn't crucified. There's no revelation of God's actions in the world by the cross. This is what Cohn's penultimate book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, is wanting to highlight. The suffering of Black people in the country as a revelatory interpretation of God's with us. And it's not that we celebrate suffering. You don't celebrate suffering, but you recognize, as Kelly Brown Douglas says, that the lengths to which God will go to identify or to demonstrate solidarity with the people who are harmed politically. Bonhoeffer saying something like that, there's a lot to unpack there. I'm gonna toss that in a slow pitch to Jeff.
I keep going back to this notion that all our theologies, as you point out, Reggie, can be constructions of domination. Our construction of God can be a construction of domination that ends up not in the I, thou encounter, but in the I, it of religion. So that our theologies themselves prevent us from an actual encounter with the reality of God. And that there is a certain way in which, if you look at Bonhoeffer, is critiquing thousands of years of Christianity that has brought his culture to the point where they have literally collapsed. And not only collapsed, but done great harm and violence in the world. And make no mistake, they did it with strong Christian support.
Right.
And, there's a whole nother world that maybe Tripp and I'll end up talking about next week when we have that open session. But there's a certain way then in which Bonhoeffer has to go back and he's looking at this heritage. And he's asking himself, how did I end up here? You said something a minute ago I want to just go back to for just a minute. Bonhoeffer is in his prison cell, and he is speaking of suffering. And there is a critique that could be made of Bonhoeffer at this point, that this is Freudian projection on Bonhoeffer's part. That he, in fact, is projecting, taking those struggles within himself and projecting those out into the universe. And so he's just having a conversation that has no connection whatsoever to anything other than his own dilemma.
Right.
And in some ways, that would be a stronger argument for me if he hadn't have been walking this path for decades, thinking about the role of religion, the role of suffering. And so there's a certain sense in which I want to say that his critique, if he had lived long and carried this out, he'd probably be the father of what we call postmodern theology or deconstruction or whatever, because he was willing to understand that the whole entire edifice may rest on a false assumption.
Yeah.
A false assumption about a religious a priori, a pre-existing thing within all human beings, and that the whole thing may in fact rest on a false assumption. In which case, I think at one point he says, "So what remains?"
Yeah.
And for him, what remains is Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and a Jesus that is not the Christ of imperialism, not a Jesus who maintains the throne, but is the suffering servant. And then in this one particular instance, then when he moves to the powerlessness of God, all metaphysics are out the window. Mm-hmm. In a certain sense. We cannot construct a Hegelian metaphysical edifice to reach the divine. We cannot construct a kind of theistic metaphysics of power or knowledge or the things that we know. We have to come at this from a completely different point of view. And, for me, I remember the first time I read this stuff way long ago. And I was like, what the hell is this? I don't understand any of this.
Yeah.
And the more I read it and the more it sat with me, it slowly, it takes a while for me because I'm thick. Oh, all the constructions of God that I have embraced as true are constructions that have been created by human hands. And so that's always the danger in theology, right? There's no safe space that any of us stand that we can say, this is protected space. This is protected space from critique. All we can do is live into a story, into a narrative, into the reality that we've been given, and say, this is my story and I'm sticking to it in some ways. But this notion that Bonhoeffer comes to this moment that says, look, whatever Christianity is, it shouldn't be the imperial power to designate to other groups their identity based on a Christian norm, which I think is one of the things that you sort of do a really good job of critiquing, the way that Christianity functions to create other identities in relationship to the white Christian norm, the white Eurocentric norm. And there's a certain sense in which Bonhoeffer gives us the space to say, all right, so maybe we can take all of that away. Maybe we can look at 2,000 years of church history. One of the things that in your book you said that I found so really interesting to me was that the church proclaimed itself as the new Israel. White Eurocentric Christians proclaimed themselves as the new Israel. And so then the church claims for itself a justification for colonizing others. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is this right, Reggie?
Yeah, that's right.
So what I kept going back to is, are we going to have to get to the point where we have to go back and look at everything, even Israel itself, and say, in what way were they justifying conquest? By claiming to be chosen. That's a radical, horrible statement for many people. But where was God in that? has always been a kind of an interesting question for me. And any space that a religion or a religious community, so-called, structures for the purpose of colonizing others should be looked at with suspicion.
Right.
I don't care what it is.
Right.
My religion, your religion, whoever's religion. If that is a space, and this is what I think, this is what Bonhoeffer's trying to critique, is that when religion functions this way, it's not really functioning on the basis of the suffering God. It has other agendas in mind. All right, I've talked too much.
Oh no, I like when you get provocative, Jeff.
Tripp, you are man.
Well,
when you get that, when you move your mouth close to the mic and you turn on that voice, that's the creepy voice, man.
It is the creepy voice. And just so you know, the steroids have worn off. So
there are a number of questions around the references Bonhoeffer, because he's, writing letters to his friend. So you can give your shorthand like, well, Barth went halfway. And then he's like, well, the German romantics do it this way. They're basically pantheists. And then you have the empiricists and they do it this way. And like, you have all these. So there were a variety of questions that came in going like, what would we gain if we knew the big picture of the changes in theology and philosophy that to help us understand what he's getting at, right, with this critique of religion and such. And so then I came up with a way of connecting the dots on a few of these because I thought this would be fun. Now, he argues that Barth goes halfway, right? And that his problem is you get a kind of positism of religion. And then he gets to, that's where he turns to like, how does the crucified one become the Lord of the religionless and all the world? Now, one of the, James Cone, it was deeply influenced by Barthian notion of revelation, but has this insistence that it didn't go the whole way, that it needed a kind of contextualization that in American context to draw the connection between the cross and the lynching tree, between the energy in the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement is the kind of energy that you see in Jesus' mission of the kingdom and such. Like, how do you negotiate that conversation where you see both Bonhoeffer and someone like Cone wanting to critique the powers, and they have this dual move of Christ is in a very particular way divine self-testimony, and it's the testimony is not the triumphalism. It's grounded in the dirt, in the suffering, and underneath. And it's in those places that Christianity has the ability, or faith has the ability, to move beyond like religion, the norming institution for Western domination and such. How do y'all see those connections between kind of Barth and James Cone's variations of that revelational center?
Yeah, so his critique of Barth centers on a revelation positivism primarily. And with Bonhoeffer, there was a concern for the God who meets us in the world, you might say, in culture. This not simply act concepts of God, but also being concepts of God, worldly, in flesh and contact, in culture and civilization. So one of the metaphors that he used, and I'm just going to turn back to some of what we were just talking about there with religionlessness. One of the metaphors he used is deus ex machina, God in the machine, which you may know is a theatrical term, that the plot gets twisted. The plot, you create a plot twist to such a degree that is an impossibility for the protagonist to be saved or to unravel this. And then this deus ex machina, this God shows up who fixes everything. Early Greek theatrical term that is criticized now as far too simplistic. And God as God who shows up only to fix problems. I'm not equating that with Bardian revelation centeredness, but I am describing something that does not demonstrate a God who is present in the ongoing day to day, in the mundaneness of daily living. How do we understand God not simply as one who shows up only to fix problems, but is present in the day to day? In the structure of religionlessness here, and Jeff, you can help me out here. The structures of religionlessness, one might say that theology as we have it, at least in the structure, in the construct of religion, is developed in time before science, in a different world, in different histories, by scholars who weren't living in the context of the scientific stuff that we've got now. Therefore, they cannot respond. They don't have the questions that we have. They don't have the situations that we have. And we hold on to this as a theological revelation of God, as theology, as our interpretations of God in the context of new science, as in the context of new philosophy. So when we have our daily lives, we know the world differently than the theologians do. But in these moments where science doesn't speak to us, where philosophy and new things don't speak to us, that's where we turn to God. Deus ex machina. God of the gaps in our knowledge. What we need is God present in the world today. An interpretation of God that moves us beyond the trappings of the religious and theological history where theology has not come of age. We are, to come of age is to be old enough to be held responsible for what you know. A world come of age is still holding on to trappings of religion and theology that are outdated. You see that all the time. Why is it that the church, that Christians are still wrestling with questions that the world has moved on from? You and your conferences are debating some of the most ridiculous time-bound things, but the rest of the world has put that to rest a long time ago, and the church is still trying to catch up. What would it mean to be Christians in a world come of age?
Yeah, Jeff, what does it mean?
Well, it means Christian Twitter looks a whole lot differently than it does right now. Just going to say, in one way, it's interesting sort of inhabiting spaces in Christian Twitter because they're doing exactly what Reggie said. They're asking the wrong question. They're asking questions nobody but them cares about. It's
Right.
like intellectual, like intellectual masturbation or something,
Exactly what it is.
Meanwhile, the world's trying to sort of figure out what are we going to do with the freaking oligarchs. You don't want to get me on a rant here, but what are we going to do with the vast concentration of wealth that is accruing more into fewer and fewer hands, who are gaining more and more power over systems like media, AI, other methods of social control? There's some significant, serious, massive questions there about inequality, about the way that identities are getting constructed so that you can oppress another human being on the basis of the fact that you've constructed that identity for them, whether it's poor or whether it's person of color or whether it's transgender or whatever it is. So there are some pretty significant issues that the world is facing that I think religionless Christianity actually, can enter into that space, if for nothing else, to cause all of that world constructing into question.
Right.
And to critique it.
Right.
And I think that's where the sort of, Bonhoeffer, and later on he's talking about his outline for a book, and I think I still wish somebody would write that. And he has this sort of profound notion, and it shows up several times throughout his writing and there is a performative aspect of Christianity, prayer, Eucharist, discipline, the spiritual disciplines. There's a sort of formation of identity that does not allow itself to be shaped and formed by domination structures, by the state, by the other sort of ideological structures of racism, by wealth or money, but is able to understand that in every human being, the suffering God is present.
Yeah.
Even the ones we hate. The suffering God is present. And that to approach the world in any other basis, to seek to dominate or to control, is not what incarnation, what resurrection, what empathy, what vicarious, representative action is supposed to represent. And there's a certain sense then in which, for me, one of the most radical spaces is that Bonhoeffer says your identity can be created on an entirely different set of structure than the way that you're currently being manipulated by the systems of control that operate to propaganda. I was going to say to propagandize, propagandy, to construct a world for you that certain people in the world really want you to believe. Mm-hmm. There's a freedom that faith in Christ offers us that allows us to see the world from a completely different perspective. I think that's one of the strengths for me of Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity. And when I see Christian nationalism taking root in the country to the point where it's literally taking over political structures, and those political structures now are starting to enact legal means through which to control the populace. I think, maybe it's time for Christianity in America to die. Maybe Christianity needs to die for something else to take its place. Something, that would be closer to this heart of the suffering God than to the almighty God of providence who works in history to give us the world that we have, which is Nazi theology, by the way. Hitler had a theology. It started with providence with a capital P.
Yeah.
All right. I'm just going to stop there.
Well, I think
ranting now.
Yeah. Well,
incoherently.
Look, you said you didn't want to rant, and then there are multiple people in the chat that were like, "We want the rant." But of the questions that came in on the chat, but also people emailed, quite a few, like Linda, was interested in how Reggie saw that connection between Bonhoeffer's critique of Christian nationalism and our present situation. And as someone that has spent quite a bit of time, in different in different circles, what do you think you've learned from wrestling with Bonhoeffer that's helped you as an ethicist as things have been changing in the West and in America?
This goes back to, in my estimation, to some degree, Christian nationalism is this blend between power, politics, and this and religion. But if one is not engaging in the blend between power and politics, a Christian blend between power and politics, which is the God risen in power, but attention to the meaning of Christ's suffering. God not in power and domination, but God hidden in suffering and shame. What does politics look like? What does that politic look like? One of the things that he's doing, I think, in all of this estimation here, and thinking about what he's doing with religion, with suffering, and so forth, Bonhoeffer is legitimately trying to discern the failures of Christianity in Nazi Germany. Ultimately, the concern here is, why isn't Christianity passing its most significant test? It has capitulated to Hitler and to Nazism. Where did this falling apart happen? And it has an interpretation of God that matches or is easily susceptible to murder, to domination, authoritarianism, resistant to empathy, resistant to what you might say is compassion, general concern. These are some of the things that he that lead him, no doubt, to pay to this empathic move. This only the suffering God can help. So religious nationalism maps onto practices of racial hierarchy, to classism, all of the isms and phobias and domination structure mechanisms of imperialism. Religious nationalism blends them with sacred license. Fascisms, they do this kind of thing here that see an ideal person, an ideal human, as the archetype for the ideal community. And it turns Christ into this figure at the apex of human hierarchy as representative of the people of this nation, this fascist structure. Dorothy Zerla describes the Christo-fascism in this kind of way. So the religious nationalism is nothing more than a page, than actually the theological justification of fascism. It's license, religious license of fascism.
That's where you talked about that kind of Gnostic move, where Jesus' body may be Jewish, but his soul's white.
Right. And acknowledging the birth of Jesus and the historical Jesus as a Jewish man. You also are doing this in acknowledgement of, or in recognition of, Christianity as a Western cultural product, a Western cultural possession. He's white. And this is one of the supersessionist moves. This is actually core to the supersessionist move, to say that that the church, the Christian West, is a replacement of Israel in the narrative of God's work in the world. Is to do this kind of Gnostic, is to embrace this Gnostic Christ, the cultural representation as white and the body is Jewish. So you have at the heart of this Christian figure, this apex on the hierarchy of human being, you have at the heart here this Gnostic problem. It's Apollinarian, where Jesus says Apollinarian heresy is that the mind is divine, but the body is human. It's not fully human, fully divine. It's
like you have to replace a part of his full humanity in order to get the divinity in, and then what is being replaced by divine is transferable to a better body.
Yeah. It's like a guy operating a machine, like Men in Black or something. But it's the mind is God, the body is human, not fully human. This is a Gnostic heresy. That is white Western Christianity.
Do you in thinking about that and your work on the impact of Bonhoeffer in Harlem, and Matt sent a long email, but in it, one of the question that I think was at the heart of him kind of processing your lecture and the book, he said, "I would love to hear Dr. Williams' thoughts on what Bonhoeffer might have seen or experienced in the Black church and in Harlem that could have informed his idea of religionless Christianity." The longer email, part of it is because the life of the Black church, even the more liberationist side of it, in the way we use the word religion in the public square, seems one very religious option, right? And so he's like, is it the community's relation to materiality that makes it religious or non-religious? You see what the tension was going. The most religious people could be the faithful members of the Black church, but then he ends up with this concept of religionless.
Yeah, so I'm going to turn here for a moment to some of the reading that I had suggested, and see there's a passage here that I'm thinking of in particular, to pay attention to the suffering God in the world, because I can think of the time that he's spending at Abyssinian. You talk about something concrete to make this move here. The time that he's spending at Abyssinian is during the Great Depression, if we recall. It's 1930, and as the saying goes, when white America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. So in Harlem, the suffering is particularly acute, and the church is, in one sense, it is you might say, a re-entering. If we're just talking about the material reality, there's to some degree a continuation of post-World War I Germany, where there's a lot of suffering visible. It's visibly on the streets here. And he's a wealthy family, and he's at a wealthy church. He's coming from a wealthy family, the church is wealthy. Abyssinian Baptist was still employing people during the Great Depression, giving away money. There is a food kitchen. There is a clothing giveaway. There is homeless. There's this housing for unhoused people and for elderly and so forth. There's school that's happening, and he is an active participant in all of this. Whereas some might say that the role of, in some of the more modernist, and he will use that term to call, as Gary Dorian describes liberal Christianity, is this kind of a midway between atheism on the left and fundamentalism on the right. This is a Christianity that is working in sync with practices of culture and civilization, to prove itself sophisticated. That this is not a concern. A sophisticated, civilizing faith is not the concern. Here, the concern is relieving suffering. The concern is to see Christ there on the street and to do something. Yeah. As it says in and I haven't found the passage here yet, but
it's similar to that shift that Cone makes from our focus for the theologians of the bourgeoisie. The focus is the non-believer, and the liberationist traditions turn towards the non-person, like the people whose material existence isn't even given the dignity in the world.
Right. To dignify the person, one must see and respond to suffering. This is, I found a sermon that I put in the revised edition of my book in 2021. I found a sermon that I couldn't find in the first edition. It's during Powell preaches it during the Great Depression. As he tells the story, his church gave him this really nice, expensive car. He didn't want it, but he gets this car, and as he's driving along in his really nice car, you might say up Malcolm X Boulevard, which is Lenox in Harlem now. Actually, Malcolm X, now Lenox. Then he's driving up Lenox Avenue, and he sees Black people struggling, hit hard by the Great Depression. Powell says, God, why don't you do something? A couple of nights later, he says he's awakened during a dream, hearing the words, Paul, why don't you do something? And like any good Baptist preacher does, he develops a sermon series. And he preaches on the naked God and a hungry God, right out of Matthew 25. I got an excerpt from that in the book, an excerpt of that sermon in the 2021 version that I didn't have in the 2014 version. And in that version, he says, when we give men and women clothes, we're giving clothes to God. You know, when we give men and women something to eat, we're giving food to God. The Bible doesn't mean this. It doesn't mean anything. Here is a direct engagement with the suffering God in the world that you will find in his claims about religionlessness. Now, whether or not there's a direct line here is, I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that this sounds like the same things that he's saying about religionlessness and about the suffering God in the world. It also sounds like what he's saying about Stellvertretung, vicarious representation. That to meet someone in the world, you're meeting the one who stands in for them. All of this, I see somebody put the page here, the page number, and I would probably I'm actually looking at the reader, but if I were to pull out stand up and pull from my other version here, but do you have it right there, Tripp, to read what someone said in the notes on page 102?
This is the suffering, like God.
Yeah.
So mine's on 102. There are way too many versions of Bonhoeffer, and
I know, isn't that something?
And I was finding for 4 different versions the readings for each week until we decided to use technology and post a PDF. Is this the passage where it's like, thus our coming of age leads to a truer recognition of our situation before God?
Let me see here.
What's the like zinger line that shows up if you were memifying the passage?
I have so much underlined from this particular letter, and I happen to know it's one of those things where I know where it is on the page. I'm going to have to go here.
Is it the July 18th one? It says the human being is called upon to share in God's suffering at the hands of a godless world.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Thus we must really live in that godless world and not try to cover up or transfigure its godlessness somehow with religion. Our lives must be worldly so that we can share precisely so in God's suffering. Our lives are allowed to be worldly. That is, we are delivered from the false religious obligations and inhibitions. Being Christian does not mean being religious in a certain way, making oneself into something or another, a sinner, a penitent, or a saint, according to some method or other. Instead, it means being human, not a certain type of human being, but the human being Christ creates in us. It's not a religious act that makes someone Christian, but rather sharing in God's suffering.
There we go.
Life.
Yeah. There we go. There we go. This is one of the claims that Cone makes as well, is that the theologians sat at Union and in other white spaces and thought about God. One of the reasons why Cone esteemed Bonhoeffer is because Bonhoeffer went over to Harlem and saw what was happening with Black people, not ignoring the experience in the life of Black people in the United States. There, one has what you might call epistemological privilege. You know, that in Black life in the United States, you have revelatory privilege to the presence of God in the world by the hermeneutical, what they would describe as liberations was described as God's preferential option for the poor and the oppressed.
Yeah.
There we have it.
So is now I know, Jeff, you said your medicine was wearing off, so I wasn't sure how much voice you had.
I'm good. Keep on going.
Well, look, I have 2 more questions, and one is a passage that was the second most asked to unpack, and I thought I'll just read it and see what you two do. because the questions heard it so different. And I know this is one that last time we spent time with Bonhoeffer, I realized I projected on it all sorts of my ideas until you set me straight, Jeff. So, but it's 369. It's the first letter, 369 if you have the reader's edition thing, but it's discussion of the resurrection. And this is after the Deus Ex Machina bit that Reggie was talking about, where people see God as like, coming in to fix everything. And he says, it always seems to me that we leave room for God only out of anxiety, which is just a brilliant line. And then below that, he says, belief in the resurrection is not the solution to the problem of death. God's beyond is not what is beyond our cognition. Epistemological transcendence has nothing to do with God's transcendence. God is the beyond in the midst of our life. The church stands at the point where human powers fail at the boundaries, where human powers fail, but at the boundaries, but in the center of the village. And then he goes on describing, how that is functioned through Scripture. But the number of people who are like, then what in the world is he talking about when the resurrection?
Yeah. The beyond in the midst of our lives.
Yeah.
The nowhere, but there. Remember what we were describing as we were talking about a world? That a world is the boundaried space that we construct epistemologically on top of endless earth, physical space. The world that we develop is one that is, you might say, it's discursive. It is the way in which language creates space. To get an education is to understand how a world was dreamed or imagined, or discursively constructed by a set of people out of Europe. They tell you, for example, I'm sitting in a chair, but what comes to mind when I say the word chair is a description of this thing here that loads this concept, this word, with meaning. My table can be a chair. A rock can be a chair. But when we invoke the word, it's filled with meaning that comes from a particular world, the discursive structures that we have been that we are swimming in. That's a world that's given to us by a set of people who have constructed it. There are things in the world that are beyond that world. Things that are not captured by the epistemological structures of a people who dreamed up our existence ideologically. To be in the world, so you might say that God exists in the world and apart from the world, or even to understand world means that understanding that as world, to be in the world but not of the world, or beyond the world. That offers us something that is, you might say, not captured epistemologically by the discursive structures that hand us the world, but that can intervene in the world, can break it open, and perhaps even offer us stuff beyond the world. That's really what a good education should actually do, encourage people to dream more. But what would an encounter with God be? One who breaks into that world, but who's also already present and beyond it, the immanent transcendent, already in the world and beyond it, not captured by the discursive structures that set up the world.
Which at some point, then you find yourself at the door of process theology. Just going to put that out there. Tripp, would you read that statement again that you just read about the resurrection?
Yeah, the resurrection line is belief in the resurrection is not the, in scare quotes, solution to the problem of death. God's beyond is not what is beyond our cognition. Epistemological transcendence has nothing to do with God's transcendence. God is the beyond in the midst of our lives.
So if resurrection is not in the now and the present, it's useless. If the beyond that resurrection points to is not present in the here and now, it's useless.
Right. Yeah, here's the imminent transcendence.
And so we look for a different interpretive lens of the world. That's a powerful lens to look at a world that is in love with its own self-destruction.
So since between the last time we did a couple of years ago when we talked about Bonhoeffer together, I reread Eberhard Jungel's God, the Mystery of the World, where he's reflecting on the letters and papers, and so this is just popping in mind now, and so this could be really wrong, and y'all can feel free to roll your eyes at me. But one of the things he does in talking about the newness of resurrection and the newness of life, like the nature of God, and he has this long like back and forth with Bonhoeffer before he gets there, is that resurrection is a breakthrough into creation. But it's not a breakthrough that comes from without and ruptures the integrity of it. It actually ruptures our ideological framing of it, right? So like God is the mystery of the world, is giving the world the dignity to become creation again. The sinner ruptured by the resurrection gives you the dignity of bearing the image of God again. That the resurrection function is the rupture of ideological closure, be it for yourself and your brokenness, the macro structures, right? Like this kind of religion that ends up supporting domination systems. And there's he uses the phrase, it usually gets translated breakthrough, rupture, that it's what Barth uses in letters and in early Romans and early in his career in Romans and thinking about resurrection. And it has this sense of, Jungel has this line where he says, the resurrection comes to each moment, but does it find purchase? Right? Because it has to do with the way the resurrected life reorients you to what was deemed world, but becomes creation. Right? Mm-hmm. So the resurrection involves this hermeneutical shift, right? Where enemy becomes lovable, where other people's suffering, we find the divine. Where the thing we seek to control through science and economy, called the world and resources, becomes the gift of existence from God. And he's, like writing 20 pages on a sentence or two in Bonhoeffer. But I wonder how does that sound? Like the way this function of resurrection and connection to this very Christocentric revelation. A lot of the questions that were like, what's going on here? I wondered if the way Jungel picks up on it as getting at something in connection to the resurrection as this depth dimension that then reorients our ideological capture of reality as objects already interpreted for the regime of truth that, in some sense claims us.
Yeah, the regime of truth, or the regime of the knowledge regimes. When I hear you describe that, it makes me think of the possibilities present in reimagining or repurposing, or what you might say, reanimating discourse. So, for example, what if when I say chair, it's not the thing that you're sitting in that comes to mind, but a new thing, but something else. This is the language that's happening around, or some of the debates that are happening around our use of the word human. To use the word human is to invoke a project, an epistemological project from Europe that is always in description of a certain kind of being, never inclusive of people of African descent, that there are no being concepts that can refer to people of African descent. And the historical discourse on religion is actually even embedded within that too. It's doing the same kind of thing, because it's showing that a certain kind of people have the human has a purpose in the world, like the gods on Mount Olympus, to order and to keep all things. But what if, is it possible that we can say human in what you're describing as a resurrected kind of way? Is it possible that we can say human and mean something other than the centuries of this European project have given us semiotically in packaging the world with a kind of being that we're referring to? What if resurrection is also heralding the death of the human, the death of ethics, the death of religion in that way, but not the death of God? Maybe the death of a God and the death of a Christ, the apex on this structure here, but the resurrection meaning something otherwise, completely other.
And we come to that point where Bonhoeffer writes about language. I'm just going to go ahead and read this, if it's all right with everybody, from Letters and Papers from Prison. What does a church, a congregation, a sermon, a liturgy, a Christian life mean in a religionless world? And then I'm skipping down. How do we talk about God without religion? That is, without the temporally conditioned presuppositions of metaphysics, the inner life, and so on. How do we speak, or perhaps we can no longer even speak the way that we used to in a worldly way about God? There's a certain sense then in which what Reggie's talking about is we're going to need new languages, and resurrection might mean something different in the new language than many people think. If it's tied to a kind of redemption myth, we may need deeper and more profound ways to talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. So we need to wrap up. So I don't want to miss any final thoughts you two have. I just want to let everyone know that next week Jeff and I are getting on and going to do. We're going to go back and forth tackling questions you've sent in and talking to each other. So that is a great time if you're new to Bonhoeffer and there are like random things like, could you just connect the dots on this, or what about this passage and stuff? Send them, and we'll try to make sure before the other guests come, you're getting your sea legs in the language and thought of Bonhoeffer. So yeah, just know that you can respond to anything on the any of the emails. But
We'll
Jeff,
talk about anything.
well, yeah, you can get us off, and we won't feel bad going on a rant either.
We'll talk about Metaxas' book.
Yeah, that might happen. Reggie, did you cry because it was so wonderful when you read Eric Metaxas' book? Is that?
Yeah, it just changed my world. You guys might be interested. I heard, there is a Hollywood version of Bonhoeffer's story. It's in post-production right now.
Oh,
That's the one you visited the set to? I think I saw. Okay.
Yeah. The writer, screenwriter, and director, his name's Todd Komarnicki. He did Professor and the Madman with Sean Penn and Mel Gibson, and wrote the screenplay for Sully and so forth. It's called God's Spy. So I'd be interested to see our thoughts about that when it comes out. But I know it's in post-production right now, and it's got.
I kind of hate it already. Sorry.
Bonhoeffer, folks, it's got enough in it to make everybody mad, I think. But it just some of the things that have got me really intrigued by it is the work of an artist in interpreting that, the meaning of Bonhoeffer's resistance. So I'm really curious to see what they're doing with it, and I mean, I'm sure you're going to be talking about it.
It's
about
a good
that
reason
movie?
to hang out.
Was that?
It's a good reason to hang out and talk about Bonhoeffer on the internet.
Yeah. It's going to break this conversation. I mean, it's going to actually make the conversation. I mean, it's going to spin off a whole other set of conversations. A lot of people are going to be talking about it. It's a big budget film.
Well, I would be interested in knowing who they consulted.
Yeah, in the screenwriting, Todd did a bunch of his own reading. I think some of us are can be involved in telling the actual story when the movie comes out, because the movie stands alone on its own. It's not meant to be. I know it's not like a documentary or something or anything like that. That's an artist doing some stuff, and I mean, yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on there. But I think we will be doing the interpreting.
Yeah, we'll see.
Well, I'll be looking forward to it. Just that way I can email you both and say, hey, remember when Reggie was talking about this?
Yeah. And Todd Komernicki is the guy who's the writer and screenwriter and producer and director. So,
all right, last question for you, Reggie. How are you feeling about the NBA playoffs?
I was bummed when my team got knocked out. Funny thing is, being from California, I know both Southern and Northern California. And it was a trip to me that my natural predisposition was for the Warriors. That's where, born and raised. And actually learned to play basketball there. But I was bummed when they went down. I thought for sure they were going to be the first team to come back from 3-1, down 3-1 to the Lakers. Now I'm a Lakers fan.
Let's good.
See how they do.
That's good. Now, when Adam Clark and I are texting in the games, we might be able to text you something nice. We're just worried you don't want to start texting in the wrong person during your NBA games.
You don't, because that's how you blow up a community.
Yeah.
But
come to the Celtics. Who is doing this? You should know better, Mark. I save all my tribal warrior energy for the NBA, and like talking about the Celtics in the comment section is just really difficult.
You started it.
I know, but I have the power of the microphone. That's just, and
I should qualify. I've been a Lakers fan. I've definitely been a Lakers, but when they're playing the Warriors, I'm not. Even though a former teammate of mine is a coach for the Lakers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Phil Handy.
Oh, nice. I love Handy. He's been the one. I listen to a lot of Lakers podcasts when I'm not doing other things, and he's the one that usually gets credit for like taking a player from like C to B+ in the middle of a season. That he watches a lot of the role players and helps them do like little angles differently, little things, and coaches them up. And LeBron's like, oh, they don't let him go anywhere else. And anyway, so you should tell him thank you.
Yep. At Skyline Junior College, we were together at Skyline Junior College in the Bay Area.
Awesome.
Warriors. That's why I go Warriors. Anyway, really good spending time with you guys.
Oh yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this, Reggie.
It's been a blast.
I know you have a busy schedule, and we're appreciative.
Yep. Getting ready for New Haven and my daughter's graduation now.
Enjoy it.
Thank you.
Okay. Talk to y'all later.
Take care.